Hello, and welcome to my video on advocacy for occupational therapists working with justice-involved individuals. My name is Alexandra Ochdorf, and I'm currently working with Life After Incarceration Transition and Reentry, also known as LATER, and I'm a student at Washington University in St. Louis in the program in occupational therapy. So this video is all about things advocacy. One of my objectives for my deck was specific to advocacy. So this video is all about the information that I learned regarding advocacy for this work and this practice setting, as well as some of the deliverables that I completed as part of my capstone. So first, I wanted to begin by talking about the designation of occupational therapy as a mental health profession. So we know that occupational therapy really does have its origins in mental health. The profession started as a means to improve the mental well-being of veterans coming back from World War I in order to engage them in some sort of a meaningful activity. And this is something that has kind of lost its way in occupational therapy. Nowadays, a lot of people come to see occupational therapists for more of like a physical dysfunction or a cognitive issue, and mental health is often addressed, but it's often addressed as a secondary factor. So not every state names occupational therapy as a mental health professional. Some states do say that occupational therapy falls under the umbrella of a qualifying mental health profession, but doesn't specifically name occupational therapy. And other states have no definition at all of what a mental health profession is. And the reason that that's important to know, and the reason why it's kind of an issue, is because it limits the access that people have to these needed services. So as I said before, if somebody has a main deficit that's related to a psychosocial issue or a mental health problem, they may not be able to seek occupational therapy as a treatment option, simply because OT isn't named a mental health profession in that state. So what exactly is the role of occupational therapy on an individual level? So as I mentioned, we do address psychosocial factors that impact a person's daily life. So 50% of the population of justice-involved individuals have a mental health condition, and that might be something like anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, substance use disorder. And those things often do impact a person's ability to function in their daily life. So an example that's pretty common with this population is anxiety. Whether or not somebody has a formal diagnosis of it or not, they often experience symptoms of anxiety. And that might impact their ability to engage throughout the day. It might impact their ability to begin social relationships, communicate effectively with other people. And oftentimes something that we'll do is we'll work on coping skills to address that need. So I mentioned substance use disorders. Over 65% of the population meets a DSM-5 criteria for alcohol or other substance use disorder. However, only 11% are receiving treatment for it. 750,000 individuals have a disability, 66% of those being a cognitive disability. I also wanted to mention that traumatic brain injury is pretty common within this population, and it's important that we consider traumatic brain injury and ask about it. Because traumatic brain injury impacts a person's cognitive skills, and it also changes a person's personality to make them more aggressive. And that's really important to know with this population, especially if somebody is coming in on charges of some sort of aggressive behavior. Now, just as the general population is aging, so is the incarcerated population. So we know the baby boomer generation is moving into older adulthood. And old age in correctional facilities is typically considered 40 years of age or older, which is pretty young in comparison to the general population. But it's important to know this because aging in a correctional facility is not very effective. There's a lot of comorbidities, a lot of physical dysfunction that comes with aging that correctional facilities just are not conducive to address. So occupational therapy is really well suited to intervene in that and assist people that are aging in this setting. So mass incarceration is a public health issue, and I kind of want to take us on a bit of a journey, I guess, to think about why it's a public health issue. A lot of people don't see mass incarceration as affecting the larger community, but I'd just like to give some information that maybe argues that that isn't exactly true. So what exactly are the ACEs? The Adverse Childhood Experience Study, or the ACE study, found that there is a connection between having experienced some sort of a traumatic event in childhood and worse physical and mental health later in life. So within this population, 97% of the people have one ACE or have experienced one adverse childhood event in their life. And about 78% have experienced 4 or more ACEs. So the more ACEs somebody has, the stronger that connection between adverse childhood experience and worse physical and mental health function is later in life. So having 4 or more ACEs is also really important to know because it increases a person's likelihood to have a lot of other conditions and a lot of other mental health problems. So somebody with 4 or more ACEs is 1,350% more likely to abuse opiates, which is just a mind-boggling number. They're also 4 times more likely to report lifetime mental illness and suicide attempt, and 10 times more likely to report self-harm. Now, this population is also 3 times more likely to have HIV or AIDS and more likely to have hepatitis C and tuberculosis. So that's also looking at infectious disease that can impact the community as well. 40% and 60% of women have more than one chronic condition. And this population does have a constitutional right to healthcare. However, that healthcare doesn't necessarily mean that it's adequate. And a lot of times there are copays that need to be paid in order to see some sort of a healthcare provider, which is not really a realistic thing for a lot of these people to pay. So then they opt to not have their health conditions treated, or if they're experiencing pain or anything like that, they may just go without having any sort of treatment for it. There's also decreased rates of vaccination within this population, which is really important to consider, especially now thinking about COVID-19 pandemic and the flu season as well going around. Now, there's also a high rate of recidivism within this population. So we know that 95% of the incarcerated population will eventually re-enter their communities, but 66% of those that are released will reoffend and enter a correctional facility once again within 3 years. Now, 82% of those people then within 10 years will reoffend. So we know that recidivism is pretty high. We know that incarceration, therefore, is not really working, and there seem to be gaps in the system that are keeping people from reoffending. Or keeping people from not reoffending. And of course, there's a social cost to incarceration. So incarceration doesn't just impact the person themselves that's being incarcerated, but it impacts their families, their loved ones. It impacts the larger community because it takes away somebody who is a valued member of that community, who could be engaging in some sort of pro-social activity and contributing to the economy, to the growth of that community. It's also important to keep in mind that if there's a child involved in this situation, let's say there's a child witnessing this whole process unfolding, that is a traumatic event for that child as well. And connecting back to what we talked about before with the ACEs, that child then is more likely to experience worse physical and mental health later in life, which just perpetuates this cycle even further. So I wanted to shout out some organizations that are doing really incredible work in this area. First being the Justice-Based Occupational Therapy Group, or JBOT. That's an initiative that's led by OT students, practitioners, researchers, faculty, all sorts of people, specifically with the goal of increasing OT's presence in the criminal justice system. And they do that through research, through program development, education, and advocacy. There's also the Coalition of Occupational Therapy Advocates for Diversity, also known as COTAD, and they are engaged in this sort of work, but engaged in a lot more broad topics that have to do with diversity. So really looking at OT's ability to create an equitable, accessible, and inclusive world, and promoting all things that are related to justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, anti-racist efforts, and anti-oppression. Of course, I have to talk about Later. Later is a wonderful program that is currently based in Michigan, doing work in Washtenaw County. And it's specifically focusing on the process of transition from incarceration to reentry to the community. So Later not only works in that, but can also work with people that are already in the community who have experienced incarceration in the past. And it provides a consistency in a person's support system, which is really important through that transition, because so much of the transition is so inconsistent and so difficult to go through without a support system. And Later really is, and this concept in general is really revolutionizing the process of discharge for a corrections facility. So a lot of these facilities may have some supports in place, but they may connect the person to different community resources, and that's all important and beneficial and needed. But there still seems to be a gap. As I said before, that recidivism rate is so high that this process of discharge just isn't really going as well as one would hope. And it's kind of revolutionizing this process of discharge by giving people the support that they need, giving them the rehabilitation they need in order to stay away from the criminal justice system and out of corrections facilities. So I wanted to talk about some relevant legislation, of course, because this is really an area where OTs can advocate and can make big changes on a national level. So first is the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act. This is specifically for redirecting funds from policing security in schools to providing trauma-informed evidence-based treatments for students. And the hope with this is that it would reduce that school to prison pipeline and keep kids in school rather than punishing them for whatever behavior they may have engaged in school. And sort of bring that rehabilitation to them that they need. The next is Pursuing Equity in Mental Health Act, which expands funding for interprofessional behavioral health teams, specifically in areas with high racial and ethnic minorities. Next is the Helping Enable Access to Life-Saving Services Act, or the HEALS Act, and that increases OT's presence in behavioral mental health services. So those last two that I just talked about are really important for establishing OT as a mental health profession and a profession that can do a lot of work in the mental health field, especially when it comes to populations that are typically underserved. The last one is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021, and this is really looking at addressing law enforcement and criminal justice reform and increasing accountability for law enforcement misconduct. So I quickly wanted to talk about some of my deliverables. First, I created a lit matrix on the prison environment, and that was looking not just at the built environment, but the culture of the environment, what health services are people receiving, what does mental health look like, also looking at gendered issues. So are women receiving the care that they need for menstruation, for reproductive health care, things like that. And also looking at the process of re-entry. So what gaps are there that OT can potentially fill in the re-entry process? And then on the screen, you see an infographic on advocacy facts. So kind of looking at all the things that I mentioned before to increase ease of dissemination of this information, because oftentimes I think since this practice setting is just beginning, a lot of students in particular don't really know where to go, don't really know where to look. And using tools like this can make things a lot more accessible and a lot easier for students and practitioners and researchers to get sort of a grasp on what exactly is the problem here, and it can do that quickly. So that was my deliverables. These are some of my references for things that I talked about in this presentation. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening. And if you have any comments or questions, please leave them down below. I'm happy to engage in this conversation and talk more about it. Thank you.